BK Academy of Chess presents King and Pawn vs. King Endgame. Other than the basic checkmates, the king and a pawn versus a king endgame is one of the most important and fundamental endgames. To be able to quickly discern whether a given position is a win or a draw, and to know the technique for playing it, the rule of the square is useful in determining whether the pawn can queen unassisted, or whether the king can stop the pawn. In this position, with black to move, can black stop the pawn from promoting? Draw a diagonal from the pawn to the last rank. This is the diagonal of the square. If the defending king can move into the square, the pawn can be captured. In this position, he can stop the pawn. If it is white's move, the pawn advances, and the king cannot move into the newly created square, so the pawn queens. However, it's not always that easy. In this position, black can move inside the square of the pawn with king e4, however, king b4. Even if the defending king can move inside the square of the pawn, the attacking king may be able to block it, as follows: king d5, king b5, king d6, king b6, king d7, and after king b7, the black king is now completely cut off. So after king d6, white pushes its pawn to a5, and after king c5, the pawn easily promotes. If the defending king cannot enter the square, sometimes it can find resources, in the form of other threats, to gain the moves necessary to catch the pawn. This is demonstrated by the famous endgame study by Richard Reddy, from 1921. It's white's move, but the king would need 2 more moves to stop the pawn. So how can white gain the 2 moves? By threatening to promote its pawn. Right? Even though black can easily catch the pawn, the king needs 2 moves, giving white just enough time to catch the pawn. So how must white play? With the move king g7, white's king is moving in 2 directions, 1 step closer to catching the pawn and 1 step closer to supporting the promotion of its own pawn. So after h4, white continues chasing the pawn with king f6, right? It still needs 2 moves to step into the square of the pawn. In essence, white's king is keeping up with black's pawn, while at the same time, getting closer to supporting the promotion of its own pawn. If black ignores white's threat by continuing with h3, then how should white play? White's king is now close enough to help support its pawn with king e6. Notice the symmetry in the positioning of the kings in relation to white's pawn. Even though it's black's move, the white king is now close enough to support the promotion of its pawn. After h2, how should white play? It's time to push the pawn with c7, and both pawns promote at the same time. Right? Again, notice the symmetry in the positioning of the kings in relation to white's pawn. Even though it's black's move, the white king is now close enough to support the promotion of its pawn. For example, if black plays king b7, white supports the pawn with king d7. So after king f6, if black plays king b6, to stop the pawn, how must white play? The king must continue traveling in both directions with king e5. And notice that white only needs 1 more move to step into the square of black's pawn. But instead giving white the move needed by taking the pawn, what if black continues pushing the pawn with h3, then how should white play? With the move king d6. Again, notice the symmetry in the positioning of the kings in relation to white's pawn. Even though it's black's move, the white king is now close enough to support the promotion. After h2, c7, it's a draw. Now after king g7, let's see what happens if black immediately approaches the pawn with king b6. How must white play? White continues moving closer to supporting its pawn and to entering the square of black's pawn with king f6, and now white only needs 1 move, so instead of taking the pawn, black starts pushing its pawn with h4, and after king e5, black is in a drawing zugzwang. If black takes the pawn, white steps into the square, and if black continues pushing, then both promote at the same time. When the defending king is within the square of the pawn, a pawn can still promote if its king can occupy a key square, also known as a critical square. The key squares of a rook pawn. An advanced rook pawn generally has two key squares, b7 and b8 for an a pawn, and g7 and g8 for an h pawn. A rook pawn has much less chance of promoting because if the opposing king can occupy any square in front of the pawn, it cannot be driven away. In addition, black can always draw if he can reach the c8 square for an a pawn or the equivalent f8 for an h pawn, except for this position, with white to move. Therefore, if white's king can reach either of the two key squares, he can keep black's king away and the pawn will promote. The pawn can also promote in this position, if white is to move, with h7. This position comes from a 1968 game between Oscar Pano and Miguel Najdorf. After king g4, black played king c7. Now, how should white play? Should the king move to the 5th rank or should white start pushing its pawn? White played king g5, because white cannot allow black's king to reach the f8 square. Here black resigned. But if the game continued with king d7, and white does not allow black to occupy the f8 square by playing king g6, if king e6, how should white continue? Rushing to jump onto the key square with king g7, gives black the draw because king f5, wins the pawn. This shows how white's pawn needs to be advanced before occupying the key square. Now after king g6, if black plays king e7, how should white continue? By occupying the key square with king g7, the only way to win. Preventing king f8, and now black's king can't get to white's pawn. White wins easily as follows: king e6, h4, king f5, h5, king g5, h6, and with the king's support, the pawn promotes. Now let's return back to the starting position. If it was black to move, how would black draw? By reaching the f8 square and preventing the white king from getting to one of the key squares, g7 or g8. Now take a look at this position, from the game between Jedian Barcha and the young Bobby Fischer. It's white's move. How does white get the draw? White simply plays king d2, followed by king c1, to keep black's king from occupying one of the key squares, the b1 and b2 squares. The pawns other than the rook pawns have a much better chance of promoting. The pawn promotes if its king can occupy a key square. If the pawn is not beyond the midpoint of the board, there are 3 key squares that are 2 ranks ahead. If the pawn is on the 5th or 6th rank, there are 6 key squares on each of the 2 ranks in front of the pawn. If the pawn is on the 7th rank, the key squares are 3 squares in front of the pawn and the 2 squares on each side of the pawn. There is an exception to the key squares with the knight pawn. Promoting the knight pawn can be very tricky when the defending king is in the corner. Notice how the white king has occupied a key square. However, if it's black's move, this is a draw. Even if the white king were on c8, this would still be a draw. This game between Harry Golombek and Arturo Pomar illustrates the exception of the knight pawn. In this position, how should white play? The best move is king h6. But white played king f6, and after king h7. How should white play? Now if white plays g6, black draws with king h8, by keeping its king in the corner. After king f7, black is forced to play king h8. Now how can white get back on track? By playing king g6, forcing king g8, back to where we started, and this time white continues correctly with king h6, king h8, g6, king g8, g7, king f7, king h7, and white wins the game. In this position, how should white play to win? White can win if his king occupies one of the key squares, and the path to a key square is not always direct. For instance, the key squares for white are b5, c5, and d5. However, black may prevent the white king from reaching a key square with king d2, king e7, king d3, king d7, king c4, king c6. And black has successfully blocked white from reaching one of the key squares. However, there's a better route for white. So what route must the king take? By going on the other side of the pawn with king c2, king e7, king b3, king d6, king b4, king c6, king c4. Now white has the opposition, and black is in zugzwang and has to give up a key square. If black plays king d6, this gives white king b5, or if black plays king b6, white has king d5, and the white king occupies a key square and has a winning position. For this lesson, the opposition is when two kings face each other with only one square in between. The side with the move must move the king away, allowing the opposing king to advance. The opposing king is said to have the opposition. However, Averbach pointed out that the opposition is a means to an end. The end is penetration to a key square. If you can penetrate without the opposition, then do so. For example, in this position, how should white play? White can seize a key square by playing king c5, king d7, king b6, occupying a key square which is necessary to promoting the pawn. Returning back to the original position, white can gain the opposition with king e4. However, black can now prevent white from getting to one of the key squares, but with what move? With king d6, and after king d4, how should black play? With king c6, white no longer has the opposition, and there's no way to get his king to a key square. With correct play, black can escape with a draw. Except for the rook pawn, the following rules apply. Rule 1. To defend against the pawn, the defending king has two key squares, the two squares directly in front of the pawn. If the defending king can occupy one of these squares, he can draw by alternating between the two squares and maintaining the opposition when one of the squares is inaccessible. For example, in this position with black to move, black would have to gain the opposition with king d6 and then jump back to alternating between the two squares. This is the one exception, but only if it's white to move. So how should white play for the win? By pushing the pawn with d7, because black has no other key squares to alternate with, he must give way with king e7, allowing king c7, and the pawn promotes. Rule 2. White wins if at least any two of the following conditions are met. A. His king is in front of the pawn. B. He has the opposition. C. His king is on the 6th rank. If the attacker can get to a position that meets two conditions, he wins. It's black to move, so is this winning for white? Two conditions have been met, opposition and the king on the 6th rank. Therefore, black cannot prevent the white king from reaching a key square. For example, after king e8, white can push the pawn to the 7th rank without check with e7, forcing black to give up its control over d7, with king f7, and after king d7, the pawn promotes. Returning to the original position, white wins because it's black's move. Right? However, if it was white's turn, white would no longer have the opposition, and advancing the pawn would check the black king, forcing the king in front of the pawn, resulting in a draw. White would have to either give up the pawn, or move its king behind, stalemating black. Is this a winning position with white to move? Okay, is it still winning with black to move? Two conditions are met, the king on the 6th rank and the king is in front of its pawn. With these two conditions, white wins no matter whose move it is, because in this case it doesn't matter who has the opposition. For example, if black plays king g8, how should white play? Notice that this is a knight pawn. White wins with king h6, king f6, is not losing, but it's more complicated. After king h8 and g6, a new set of conditions are met, opposition, and the king on the 6th rank. Here, if it were white's move, black could draw. but it's black's move, giving white the opposition. So after king g8, white pushes the pawn to the 7th rank, without check, forcing g7, king f7, and after king h7, the pawn promotes. Return back to the original position, but with white to move. White wins because two conditions have been met, the king on the 6th rank and the king in front of its pawn. So how should white play to win? Because this is a knight pawn, you have to be careful. Should white play king h6, king f6, or king f7? If white moves king f6, how should black play? Black can give white a hard time with king h7. If white pushes the pawn with g6, how can black draw? With the move king h8, right? Because we know that pushing the pawn to the 7th rank with check ends in a draw, and here if white plays king f7, it's a stalemate. The easiest way to win is with king f7, and the pawn promotes in 3. King h6 is not losing, but it gets white nowhere. Because after king g8, what does white have? Nothing after king g6, because black just returns back with king h8. However, playing king h6, king g8, the game could end in a draw with g6, because of king h8. Now white only meets one condition, because now black has the opposition. Black can hold for the draw. In this position, two conditions are met, opposition, and the king in front of the pawn. Knowing that white has the opposition, whose move is it? Black has the move, allowing white to occupy one its key squares. For example, after king d6, white has king f5, occupying a key square. Now let's see how white wins. King d7, king f6, king d8, e4, king d7, e5, and after king e8, white can meet all three conditions with king e6, placing his king in front of the pawn, gaining the opposition, and on the 6th rank. Now after king d8, white promotes easily with king f7. Now, after black played king e8, if white tried e6, black could hold with king f8, because now white is meeting only one condition, king on the 6th rank. Black has the opposition because it's white's turn to move. Here's example from Marochi vs Frank Marshall, Monaco 1903. How does black win? Where are the key squares and how should black maneuver its king? Because the pawn has not crossed the river, the key squares are the three squares that are 2 ranks ahead. To get there, first black gains the opposition with king g4. Notice how black has satisfied 2 of the 3 conditions, opposition and king in front of the pawn. So after king h2, black can grab a key square with king f3, and after king h3, black pushes the pawn to g4, forcing king h2. Now how must black continue to win the game? Remember, when promoting a knight pawn, you have to be careful. Marshall played king f2, forcing king h1. Now how should black promote the pawn? With king g3, right? This allows white to gain the opposition with king g1, but black still has the king in front of the pawn and it's on the 6th rank, meeting 2 of the 3 conditions. Now how must black continue? Because black is promoting the knight pawn, the answer is king h3, and after king h1, black can start pushing the pawn g3, king g1, g2, forcing king f2, and the pawn promotes after king h2. In this position, all 3 conditions are met, the opposition, in front of the pawn, and on the 6th rank. So white wins easy. For example, after king d8, white prepares the path for the pawn to promote with king b7, and the pawn promotes in 3. Returning back to the original position, if it's white to move only 2 of the 3 conditions are met, but that's enough to win. For example, king d6, king d8, c6, king c8, c7, king b7, king d7, and the pawn promotes. This emphasizes the importance of getting the king to the 6th rank in front of the pawn. If this configuration is achieved, white wins no matter which side has the move. For rook pawn, it is possible for black to draw even if all three conditions are met. In this position, white has the opposition, king on 6th rank, and is in front of the pawn. However, black can still hold for the draw. For example, after king b8, notice that it's impossible for white to maneuver its king to one of the key squares. So what are the key squares for white? b7 and b8. So play may continue with king b6, king a8, and all black needs to do is go back and forth between a8 and b8 as follows: a6, king b8, a7, king a8, leading to a stalemate. Also, after king b8, king b5, king a8, king b6, king b8, a6, king a8, white will have to either give up the pawn or force stalemate. Even with white to move, it's still a stalemate. For example, after king b6, king b8, a6, king a8, a7, the game ends in stalemate. Here's a useful drawing method. Imagine that the white king has just taken black's h-pawn. Though the black king was trailing behind and not able to protect its pawn, black can still hold for the draw. With white to move, we have king h8, and black traps the white with king f8, and notice how white is unable to maneuver its king to g7, or g8. And after h7, king f7, the position is stalemated. Even with black to move, this position is a draw. So how should black hold this position? Remember, the f8 square is a key square for black. Black has king f8. Even with white being able to escape from out in front of its pawn with king g6, black has king g8, and we know this to be a draw. Right? White is unable to occupy a key square, g8, or a g7. In this position it's white to move. Black's king is in front of the pawn, but it is not on its 6th rank and it does not have the opposition. How can white defend this position? What are black's key squares and how can white keep black's king off of those squares? By gaining the opposition with king b2, preventing black's king from making any forward progress. After king c4, how should white defend? By maintaining the opposition with king c2, the black king is unable to make forward progress, and if the pawn now advances with b4, how should white play? What are black's key squares and how can white keep black's king off of those squares? White can occupy one of its key squares for defending with king b2. Now that black is unable to make progress, by alternating between the two squares and maintaining the opposition when one of the squares is inaccessible. If black advances its pawn with b3, what move must white make to hold for the draw? White stays on its key squares with king b1, right? Remember, the key squares are the two squares directly in front of the pawn. Now if black plays king c3, white simply grabs the opposition with king c1, and black is unable to make progress because advancing the pawn to the 7th rank with check leads to a draw, as follows: b2, king b1, king b3, stalemate. Take a look at this endgame between Saito, Zergling, Gork and Bobby Fischer. It's black's move. How does Bobby sidestep defeat with a draw? Where are white's key squares and can black prevent the white king from getting there? This one is a bit more tricky than what it looks. However, opposition is the key. Black plays king b8, waiting to gain the opposition, after the white king advances to the 5th rank. Notice how any move by black to the 7th rank allows white to gain the opposition. Here white agreed to draw, but the game continued with king b5, and black played king b7, gaining the opposition to prevent white from maneuvering its king to a key square. Now if white moves left, black moves left; if white moves right, black moves right; and if white moves back, then black could also move back, but even better, black could move forward to occupy one of its key squares for defending, on b6. Now let's see how white wins. If black advanced his king to the 7th rank with king b7, white could gain the opposition with king b5, forcing black to give up a key square to white. For example, king a7 gives white king c6, forcing black to move back, for example with king b8. Now can white advance the pawn? The answer is yes, because its king is on a key square. However, it's good practice to prepare the way for the pawn, as follows: king b6, gaining the opposition, and after king a8, preparing the way with king c7. Now after king a7, the pawn can freely advance, right? This is normally the case. However, because this is a knight pawn, after b5, king a8, if the pawn continues advancing, it's a draw. So how does white win? With king b6, forcing king b8, allowing black to have the opposition. However, white is in front of its pawn and on the 6th rank, satisfying 2 of the 3 conditions. Now white moves to the h-file with king a6, and after king a8, white can continue promoting its pawn with b6, king b8, b7, promoting to the 7th rank without check, forcing the king out with 10. kc7, and now the king secures the promotion square with king a7, and the pawn promotes. That completes this lesson on king and pawn versus king endgame. I hope this video has helped, and thanks for tuning into BK Academy of Chess, where together we build, and over the board we even the score.